What is up, you guys? Welcome back to my channel, and if you're new here, just welcome. My name is Gemma Jade, but today we are going to be talking about encounters with forest demons. This is going to be a series. There are forest demons everywhere. There are all different kinds of creatures that lurk around in the forest. I know I have a lot of part ones that I need to put part twos out, a lot of part twos that I need to put part threes, and that's what I'm going to be working on from here on out. So I'm in the middle of revamping my setup once again. Here is the green screen that's been there for 8 months. I know I have my sticky notes, but that's all for work, so I don't forget what I'm doing with y'all, right? So I must say, I didn't start off with a plan to do a video on this today, although I do admit it's a great idea. What had happened was I was working on some scripts for MP&M, and after like 4 hours, my eyes got super tired and I needed to take a break, so I laid down to take a nap. When I laid there, I turned on the Discovery Plus app, and I was really frustrated and annoyed because I'd seen every single thing that's under true crime on that app. I watched most of what's in the paranormal section too, besides the ghost hunter shows, because I don't like those. They never capture any real verifiable evidence or photo/video proof that they saw what they claimed to have seen. And with me, you gotta have actual evidence, right? Plus, the only time I'm not watching shows like PJ Masks or Fireman Sam is when I lay down to go to sleep at night, and I'm usually so tired I'm asleep within like 40 seconds, and I can't leave anything open on the TV that could scare RJ if he were to wake up for even just a second, a small amount of time, right? If he looks up and sees some kind of forest demon on the TV at 3 o'clock in the morning, he's going to flip out, and he does wake up sometimes several times a night. So anyway, I came across this show called These Woods Are Haunted. I'll be the first to admit there are a lot of Bigfoot encounters on this show of all different varieties. I'm still getting used to the cryptid thing and trying to force myself to be interested in some man-ape who I personally think is just an interdimensional being who can jump easily from here to there, and that's why we can't ever catch him. Yet, anyways, I also believe that's why he's always blurry. So I fell asleep with the show on, and I woke up to see some guy telling a story about something terrifying he not only saw in the forest surrounding some cabin he was in. It took me a minute to wake up and realize what gold treasure I had come across and what provoked me to do a video on this, or who am I kidding, several videos, a series of videos, right? Videos about not only demonic encounters for my series on demonic possession coming either this fall or winter, but also the many demons and spirits that haunt the forests and woodlands all over the world. I mean, beasts and fairies, UFOs and Bigfoots, witches, and all kinds of monsters may as well be synonymous with forests and woods at this point. It's becoming so common these days, it's like, I don't know what it is. Perhaps the veil is thinning, maybe it's even lifting. I don't know. But what I do know is that I will only recount stories to you unless expressly stated otherwise that I believe in 100%, that I believe are true and something we should all watch out for when we go camping, either by ourselves or with our families, or God forbid, with our children. Going hunting, even when going on what you think will be a simple and relatively quick day hike, again, alone or otherwise, I want you guys to be prepared. Not just for the usual bears and snakes, attacks by wildlife, but really and truly prepared for the darker things in the woods at night, even during the day. There's something going on in the world today in the woods and forests of the world. With over 700 million acres of land in the United States alone being all woods and forests, we need to be prepared. Why am I so interested in demons, you may be asking yourself? Well, I'll tell you why I'm interested in them, and also why I'm doing such a long, drawn-out, and in-depth series on them. Again, because I want you to be prepared. There are many forms of possession, including some that are extremely mild. That guy who beats his wife and drinks too much and who needs anger management, yeah, he's most likely possessed by a lesser demon. Guys, I believe wholeheartedly and 100% that in my addiction, I too was possessed. Like the man in the Bible who roamed the cemetery and the townspeople were afraid of him because he would growl and attack them. He couldn't eat and spewed curses to them. But Jesus healed him, and guess what? He was no longer possessed but still alone, because now the people were even more scared of him because he wasn't his usual self anymore, good or bad. That is also us people in recovery. I mean, am I right? Okay, I'm getting off track. Let's start with the story of who I'll call Eddie, because I'm not sure if I can use his real name without permission, which I obviously didn't get, and I don't want to be getting myself in any trouble now, do I? When Eddie was 11 years old, he lived in Colorado with his mom and stepdad. The family had a cabin about 7 hours away from their home in Red River, New Mexico. He stated that he was always outdoors doing something and hardly ever in his house. He loved the outdoors and would hike, fish, camp, and just simply roam in the forested areas around his house and also around this extremely secluded cabin in the woods his parents owned that they would vacation at. Eddie's encounter is with something I've heard many people have had encounters with, especially in recent years, and I am convinced it's a forest demon called a Kali. Unfortunately, aside from Wiki Fandom, I can't find much actual information on it, except for these strange and terrifying, seemingly random events taking place in the woods. So anyways, Eddie and his family took the long drive to this secluded cabin to get away for a while. He often walked for hours alone, and that's exactly what he was doing that day. He noted how there were birds chirping and the sound of the bugs and the crickets and all the noises that nature was making that day. The wind was blowing through the trees, and it was a regular day for him exploring the majestic, wondrous, and quite isolated woods surrounding his family's cabin. This event took place in broad daylight too, which is also becoming more and more common as well. So Eddie's mother and stepfather were supposed to take him fishing early in the morning around 6:30 so they could catch something to eat for breakfast. Eddie decided at the last minute he didn't want to go and wanted to kind of just hang out by himself inside the cabin. So off his parents went to the lake and Eddie stayed behind. As he was sitting there playing cards by himself and just relaxing, Eddie said he heard a noise like somebody was walking up the driveway. Even though he knew it was too soon for them to be back, he assumed and tried to convince himself it was his parents coming back with the fish from the lake to make some breakfast. When he looked out the window towards the driveway, which he had a full view of the entire thing by the way, he said he didn't see anyone or anything that could be making the noise he heard of the footsteps. The heavy footsteps he thought were his parents. What he did see though was an unusual fog and mist coming up out of the woods and covering the entire driveway, part of the woods where it was coming from, and also some of the cabin. This was unusual to him because in all the years he and his family had been going to this cabin, he hadn't ever seen a mist or fog rise like this before, or really at all. As he was looking out the window, something in the woods about 50 yards off caught his eye. He described it as, quote, kind of like a guy who had deer legs and a face that looked like someone was wearing a hollowed out deer skull, end quote. The thing also had black horns, twisted and shining in the distance. He said at first he couldn't see this thing's eyes, but once it turned its head to him, then that's when the absolutely petrifying fear struck him. He couldn't understand what he was looking at. There were two deep and dark, completely black and hollowed out holes where the eyes should have been. At first it was just staring at him, and he was so scared and only 11, so he decided to squat down and try to hide underneath the windowsill. He said after he ducked down, he figured the thing would go away, but he was too scared to get back up and see if it was still there. So 11-year-old logic, right? Just squat down, and if you can't see me, then I'm not here. You know, I guess that's logic for a little kid. He didn't have to wait long to find out the answer though, because he heard 3 extremely loud and heavy steps coming from the woods up to the porch of the cabin. He's unsure whether the thing flew or transported or jumped or what, but in just 3 steps, it was able to cover a distance of 50 yards. It was then knocking on the front door. The knocking got louder and louder and more persistent as time went on. Suddenly, he heard his mom's voice asking to be let in. He knew it wasn't his mother and figured she could just let herself inside if she needed to, because obviously she had a key to her own cabin. Then the voice wasn't asking anymore, it was demanding. "Don't make me ask again," it said to him. This thing would pound on the door harder and harder each time. Eddie silently refused to let it inside. It was like his mother's voice was playing very slowly and somehow backward on a tape recorder and asking to be let in and threatening him not to make her ask him again. Eventually, the creature/demon was physically kicking the door but couldn't gain entry. I right away thought of the black-eyed kids and how they are constantly at your front door demanding entry. However, that theory came to rest later on in Eddie's story, as we will eventually see. As suddenly as it started, the banging stopped and there was no sound. He heard footsteps walking off the porch and a kind of demonic chuckle. Suddenly, all was quiet until eventually Eddie's mother and stepfather came home when he was still hiding underneath the windowsill. As you can imagine, the 11-year-old kid was quite frightened and shaken. He asked them if they had seen anything or heard anything strange while down at the lake and began to try and explain to them what it was he had seen and what had happened next. They said they hadn't seen or heard anything unusual and tried to reassure him that there was no creature like that which existed on this planet, and that maybe he was just falling for a trick of the mind, and perhaps he had been a bit traumatized seeing some regular animal tearing apart or eating a deer or something, and his mind kind of made up this thing. This makes absolutely zero sense, but okay. What about the pounding on the door and trying to mimic your voice, Mom? But I digress. Eddie said he didn't think he would ever see the creature again, and he moved on with his life. What I was wondering though was was this forest demon thing just messing with the young boy? Because we will very soon learn that it didn't need permission to enter a home, and I'm sure with its heavy hooves and supernatural strength, which all demons are known to possess, how did it not gain entry by kicking and banging on that door? Also, it doesn't need a door to get inside a home either, as we'll see in a little bit. Eddie said that as his life went on, he thought about that day here and there, but not really too often, and less and less. He would tell the story around the campfire or when visiting the cabin with other family and friends, but it became somewhat of a ghost story, a legend his own mind had convinced him he had somehow made up that fateful day when he was 11 years old. As he got older, Eddie continued taking solo hikes throughout the woods near the cabin and elsewhere. On a beautiful day in May, 6 years later when he was 17, Eddie was still undeterred and infatuated with and captivated by the woods and natural forests of North America, and on this day, he was in Montana. He was on a 37-mile hike on the top of the Madison Range, about 12,000 feet in elevation. He was planning on hiking from peak to peak and explained that there was no one else around because this particular spot, these peaks he was hiking, were unknown to most other people. The first thing that led him to believe something was wrong, he said, was that all of a sudden everything just stopped. Does this sound familiar? We see and hear about this all the time. It even happened to me with my Glimmerman encounter. It was as if somebody had flipped a switch and suddenly there was no noise at all. Not the sound of the wind in the trees or the birds. The crickets had stopped, and there was also no wildlife at all within his line of sight. No birds, chipmunks, squirrels, deer, nothing. There was absolutely nothing but the quiet and stillness of these dense woods. Eddie said he suddenly got this really anxious and panicky feeling and knew he was being watched by something. When he looked over and saw something looming in the distance, lurking and just staring him down, he thought maybe it was just some, quote, Montana people, end quote, in the woods, playing jokes on people and trying to scare them. He then said he realized it wasn't a human and started thinking of what kind of animal it could be, until it finally dawned on him what it was he was seeing. It was his old friend, the forest demon, from when he was 11 years old. I've often wondered if this would be the same one, like if they get attachments to people, or if there are many and this was just a different one who somehow knew the other one was connected to Eddie. He said the creature looked exactly the same and was just standing there watching him. This is when he says he finally realized he had actually seen and experienced what he had convinced himself he hadn't back when he was just a kid. He went on to say that in the literal blink of an eye, the thing disappeared. He waited 10 minutes to see if it would come back or reappear and show itself to him again, but it didn't, so he started to continue on his hike. He had the feeling, however, that the thing was definitely still with him in those woods, stalking him and waiting for the right moment to attack and or approach him. He had left his car behind at the beginning of the trailhead, which was very far away for how late at night it was, and he didn't want to walk the distance to be able to drive home and leave the forest with the demon behind him. I personally don't know how he let himself just live with this with almost no reaction and seemingly no fear as he continued to roam the woods alone after the first encounter, and then decides to stay the night in the deep depths of an isolated forest all night with nothing but his campfire in the moonlight to show him what was possibly lurking around him and his camp, but once again, moving on. So, Eddie stayed the night in the woods only hours after another encounter with this demon thing, which, by the way, he knew was following him around now. He did say, though, that after seeing this thing, he was extremely fearful that it was going to come for him again, and this time make some kind of contact to attack him in some kind of way. Nothing happened, though, and he finally was able to fall asleep in his tent. He said that this night was the first time he had ever had a nightmare about this creature, and that he had continued having them from there on out, when he had never even had nightmares about anything really ever before. Now they would become a regular occurrence. In this first one, though, he remembered he was laying in his tent and sleeping in his nightmare as well as in real life. And the forest demon was roaming around right outside of his tent. He tried to remain perfectly still and completely silent, but then all of a sudden the beast ripped through the tent and killed him. It killed him in his dream. When he woke up the next morning, he was afraid to be alone, and he said he knew that this thing was not only around him, but that it had definitely attached itself to him. Eddie says he knows the thing is constantly lingering around him, and he can sense and feel its presence constantly. He then goes on to bring his friend, who I will call Casey, who explains in detail her encounter with this demonic forest being. Eddie was visiting her and staying the night at her place when it happened. She stated he always stayed at her place when he was in town, and although they were nothing more than friends, they slept in the same bed. They were extremely close. So this one night, he was at Casey's house a couple of months later after the incident while hiking in the woods in Montana. He said the thing became more and more violent the more he interacted with people, almost like it was jealous of anyone he spent too much time with or started to care for. He may be onto something here because he cared a great deal for Casey and spent a lot of time with her at this point. This night, Eddie decided to tell Casey about this demon, but he only told her that he had, quote, a thing, end quote, which was attached to him. The way he said it, I can understand why she just laughed it off. Like, yeah, sure, you have this whatever thing. Also, Eddie seems to kind of have just allowed her to do so, to just laugh and shrug it off as if it were no big deal and not something she should definitely be aware of because of how dangerous it is. But okay, Eddie, dick move. Moving on. After having dinner and some wine and hanging out that night, Eddie had attempted and failed miserably in telling and or warning Casey about this forest demon, which had attached itself to him and was most likely going to come after her out of jealousy. They decided to get some sleep. She said she had a hard time falling asleep that night, but that Eddie was in such a deep sleep it was almost unnatural how deeply he had passed out. So as she was tossing and turning and trying to sleep, she felt something on the bed, which she describes as something like as if a cat were to have jumped onto the bottom of the bed while she and Eddie were lying in it. This concerned her at first because she didn't have any pets. She convinced herself, however, that she was either imagining it or half asleep, or that Eddie had just moved a weird way and it felt like it had come from the bottom of the bed. As she laid there and tried to not only sleep, but now put this very uncomfortable and creepy feeling out of her mind, something else happened. She had finally fallen asleep and was woken up to something touching her leg. She asked Eddie why he was touching her, but then realized he was still in this weird and unnaturally deep sleep, kind of comatose state thing. So it wasn't him. The feeling stopped and she chalked it up to whatever and goes back to sleep. A few minutes later, something is touching her leg again, only this time whatever it is grabbing her leg really hard over and over again, and then she feels like she's being scratched. She looks over and sees Eddie still completely passed out, so she screams and pulls her legs up and looks under the covers but sees nothing. As soon as she sat up, everything stopped, and then she tried to shake Eddie and wake him up, but he just wouldn't wake up. She said it wasn't her imagination because it was just too vivid to have all been in her mind. Casey was so fearful that something else was going to happen that she stayed up all night in bed awake, terrified and jumping at every little noise. Eddie was still completely sound asleep. When she woke up the next morning, if you could call it that because her sleep was so unrestful, Casey says she felt like she hadn't slept at all. She decided not to tell Eddie about what had happened to her the night before with the thing pulling her leg and scratching her. That is, however, until she stood up to get out of bed and saw the blood. Someone or something the night before had actually attacked her. As she already knew, and now this confirmed, she wasn't imagining it or half asleep and maybe having a vivid dream or nightmare. She was actually attacked and was bleeding with scratches going all the way up and down both of her legs from ankle to thigh. This is when Eddie finally woke up. They cleaned her wounds off, and as they did, Casey finally told Eddie what had happened, but she told it to him as though it were some kind of nightmare. She explained that Eddie looked concerned and, quote, grave, end quote, and that it was a different kind of look and even vibe he was giving off than just a concerned friend, like he knew more than he was saying. Eddie said all he could think of was this demonic entity and that he somehow got the feeling it had attacked Kelsey because it was either jealous he was spending time with her or because it was trying to cut him off from all other human contact by either scaring others away from him or scaring him into just not dealing with or spending time with other people and staying alone all the time. Maybe to be alone all the time to go on those long hiking excursions and camping trips in the forests and woods where the demon could stalk him better. 2 nights later, Eddie was still hanging out with Casey and spending his nights at her house with her, still sleeping in the same bed even after the vicious attack on her legs too. Casey and Eddie were watching a movie together in her bed when Eddie fell asleep first. Casey was staying up to finish watching the movie. As she was sitting there with Eddie laying next to her, he all of a sudden started kicking violently in his sleep and moving his body as though he were fighting someone off. He was also talking and mumbling nonsensical things in his sleep. She couldn't understand any of what he was actually saying, but she knew something was off because she had spent so many nights with him and he had never acted like this or spoken in his sleep at all. It got to the point where it was so bad, Casey decided to wake him up. As she tried to do this, however, the minute she touched him to try and shake him awake, Eddie started convulsing and went into some sort of weird seizure. The TV also went to full static while this was happening, despite the movie still running on it as of up until she went to touch him. So it was playing. As soon as she touches him, the picture goes full static. Eddie said from his point of view, he could see himself from above shaking and convulsing next to Casey. He explained it was like he was possessed and could only be there to watch what was happening. He had no use or control of any part of his body and was completely helpless to stop whatever was going to happen next. Just as quickly as it had started, though, the convulsion and word static on the TV stopped. Eddie's body went completely limp and the movie came back on the screen right where it had stopped off and turned to static as if it had never been interrupted to begin with. Eddie said, quote, "I remember waking up standing over Casey. It felt like I wasn't in my body, like someone else had the reins, so to speak," end quote. Casey was trying to wake him up and make sure he was okay when then all of a sudden she explained that she was overcome by this, quote, "really heavy feeling," end quote, and anxiety unlike anything she had ever felt or experienced before in her entire life. She was suddenly gripped with absolute fear and terror and dread and just couldn't understand why. Yes, she was concerned for Eddie and frightened about what was happening with him, but that shouldn't have produced this massive, almost primal amount of anxiety that she was feeling all of a sudden in this particular moment. She somehow instinctively knew as well that this overwhelming feeling had nothing to do with her fear for Eddie's well-being. She sensed something or someone behind her and turned around to see what it was, and that's when she came face to face with this demon from the forest that had attached itself to Eddie so long ago. So here is why I said originally that we know it doesn't need permission to enter a home. It had to have been just messing with Eddie when he was in the cabin all those years ago, and it was pretending to be his mother and trying to kick the door down. That's also probably why it gave up so easily as well. She described it at first as a kind of shadowy figure across the room in the corner and said it was almost as if it was as tall as the ceiling, which, while we don't know exactly how tall her ceiling was, think of your average ceiling in your average house and go from there. That's got to be at least 8 feet tall, probably 10 or 11, right? She thought she was imagining it and shook her head and tried to blink it away, but when she opened her eyes, it was still there, and that's when it came fully into view, exactly what she was looking at. She described it the exact same way Eddie had originally, with the horns and the deer skull with the hollowed eyes. It had deer legs and hooves for feet. Remember, too, that Eddie had never said anything more than he had, quote, "a thing," end quote, attached to him. She laughed it off, and he never went on to describe it any further to her after that. This forest demon thing just stood there completely still and was staring at her. She turned to try waking Eddie up again and let out a blood-curdling scream, and when she turned back again, it was gone. She wasn't sure if it had left or was still somewhere else in the house. Finally, Eddie came to, or woke up, whatever you want to call it, and she told him the entire account of what had just happened. Eddie then explained to her that he was actually seeing through the thing's eyes while it was there watching her and him, with her trying to wake him up, but also when she was staring directly at it. So when this thing was looking at her, when she was staring at it in the corner of the room, Eddie was seeing her through this thing's eyes as well, not only above them watching her try to wake him up. Eddie felt like he was definitely possessed in that moment, and the two of them were completely terrified because he felt like this thing was getting more and more aggressive and dangerous, especially when he was around and spending time with people he cared about, like Casey. Eddie then decided to cut contact with her for the most part. While they still remain friends, he no longer goes and visits her and refuses to spend time with anyone else or let anyone at all get too close to him, as this thing is still haunting him. Not only in his nightmares, but he says he intuitively knows, like instinctually deep down, that this thing is still attached to him and just waiting for its moment to strike outside of a nightmare. He has no idea what it is or exactly what it's waiting for. He doesn't know what it actually wants from him, except maybe to just terrorize him and his loved ones. Since Eddie stopped coming around, Casey has had no further problems in her home or in her life at all, and says life went back to normal like before it ever happened. There are no residual effects left on her or her home. Eddie, however, now lives in fear and isolation. I don't understand why he doesn't search out exactly what this thing is, find out what the attachment is and why it chose him, but also, why doesn't he try to do something about it? Just listening to him talk about it, you can see he's a very traumatized person because of this whole ordeal, yet he continues to do nothing at all except sit and live with this thing attached to him, possibly attached to his soul. What also doesn't make sense to me is that this story ended with Casey saying how this whole thing didn't change her and Eddie's relationship at all, and that they're just really great and super close friends still. However, like I said, it also ended with Eddie talking about how he wouldn't go around either Casey or anyone else anymore until this thing went away. So that's kind of confusing. So the story doesn't actually completely end here, though. For some reason he can't explain, Eddie is drawn back to that old cabin in Red River, New Mexico, where he first encountered this demon all those years ago. He says it's overwhelming sometimes, his drive or will to go back there. He stated that he wasn't sure if it was a good idea or not to go there, so he hasn't yet. I wonder if it's this thing drawing him back, or perhaps his spirit guides, or something good and light and pure that's telling him, urging him, if you will, to return back there, because for whatever reason or however, it's going to somehow come to a head and put an end to the attachment. If I were him, I would have already gone back there, not without doing some extensive research and perhaps bringing some sort of white witch or shaman with me, but still. Eddie stated, quote, "I was afraid it was trying to kill me, but now I just want to know what it wants. I want to know what its end game is," end quote. What do you guys think about that one? Have you heard anything about forest demons like this? Have you had any encounters with that? You know, I'll put my email at the end and at the description box for you to send in listener encounters. This really scared me because I've heard so many stories about demons like this in the forest, creatures, spirits in the forest that are like this. American Horror Story, My Roanoke Nightmare, right? Lady Gaga's part with the first original ever witch of the world, right? From ancient times. This is something ancient and dark, and we need something to fight it. I know there's something out there, either some kind of magics or some kind of white witch or blessing or prayer or something that can keep these things at bay, but I don't think they're ever actually going away. I think they're older than time. They transcend time. But that's just my opinion. Let me know what you think in the comments below, as always. So our next encounter is a little bit different, but with the same running theme of a demon encountered in a forest. This time, though, it was encountered in a very old cemetery, which was located in the middle and thick of a huge and dense, dark and scary forest in the woods of Florida, of all places. I just want to let you guys know while it's on my mind, in case I ever get to say it in the end, I have enough for an entire series of not only demons encountered in the forest, but all different kinds of scary and dark entities, beasties, and creatures that people have come across in one forested area or another all over the world. Okay, so this is a story of 3 friends who were out one night looking for some fun and trouble, maybe some scares too. Maybe, though, they got a bit more than they bargained for, especially one of them who decided to be an a-hole and act disrespectfully towards spirit and their world while exploring a desolate and dark cemetery in the middle of the night. Just a friendly reminder to all you crazy kids, don't ever mess with something you don't know anything about, and never be disrespectful towards spirit in any way, shape, or form. It isn't a game, something to be played with or joked about. It's real and it's serious, and the consequences could be your own possession, death, soul attachment, or something much, much worse that your mind can't even imagine. Here it is. This next encounter takes place in Palm Bay, Florida, United States. This town is about a 45-minute drive from Orlando. 3 friends, who we will call Mike, James, and Jen, were all hanging out one night together at Jen's house while her parents were away for a weekend. Mike and Jen are dating, and James is a mutual friend of them both, but has known Mike and been best friends with him since middle school. This happened in 2010 when they were on summer break before their sophomore year, so they're all freshmen. They were all in high school and were completely bored out of their minds, resorting even to trying to juggle to keep themselves amused. This is when Jen came up with the idea to try this old Ouija board she had found in the attic of the house. They were all excited to try it out, but upon reading the instructions, they realized they had a few hours to kill. It said they should wait until 3 a.m., which is the dead time, to try the board for the best results. It was only about 12:30, 1 a.m. at the time, and in the vein of how excited the guys were to try the board out, Jen came up with something else they could do while they killed time waiting for 3 a.m. to roll around. She suggested they go to this extremely old and creepy, completely isolated graveyard surrounded by deep, dense forests and woods, which was a little out of the way, but only a half-hour or so drive. So the guys admitted that they had been drinking a bit and their adrenaline was pumping, so they were amped up and ready to go and explore this graveyard. Mike specifically said he didn't believe in any of, quote, this stuff, end quote, meaning I'm sure ghosts and spirits and all of that stuff. So off they went, and again, according to Mike, quote, just looking for a good time, end quote. He explained too that this graveyard was surrounded by nothing but woods for miles and miles. So, I reiterate, completely and totally isolated. James said when they first got there, he was curious but skeptical as he hadn't ever explored a cemetery before. He had been to them for funerals and that's it. Honestly, though, I think Jen was the only one who believed in any of this kind of stuff, and she knew a little more than the guys going into it. So they were all excited and nervous. You guys know those feelings, right? I mean, I know that I do, because it's the same feeling I get every time I have any kind of experience with the supernatural or paranormal. Even after all this time, it's still those same two feelings every single time: excitement mixed with fear. The three of them are walking around the cemetery and trying to scare each other. The first thing James said he noticed, though, was not only how old the dates on the graves were, and the fact that one part was a graveyard for children. The dates from birth to death were only like within 2 to 4 years of most of the tombstones, and that bothered him for some reason that he couldn't quite put his finger on. As James was checking out the children's graves, Mike and Jen came across an old mausoleum. They called James over, and that's when they decided they wanted to go inside of it. They tried as hard as they could, but the door was definitely and completely locked shut tight, and the window they were trying to peer into was not only too high off the ground, but also was too tiny for anyone to try and climb through. Also, it seemed to be locked up tight shut as well, as I said, and there were no lights on inside of it either. It was about 12 to 15 feet tall. So after a few minutes, they finally gave up on getting inside the mausoleum, which they admit to even trying to break the door down or break the lock with no success. They decided to move on and explore more. Jen had a digital camera and was snapping pictures the entire time. Yes, I think cell phones were around in 2010, but they aren't mentioned here. The digital camera does come back into play in a few minutes though, so pay attention for that. So as they're walking around and seeing what's up with this creepy graveyard, Mike decides he has to relieve the call of nature, if you know what I mean. He had to pee, okay? But here's the thing. Instead of going in any one direction and finding tons and tons of trees and forested land, he decided, like a normal semi-drunk, buzzed 17-year-old male, to pee all over a few of the graves. Jen and James yelled at him and weren't too happy, but they weren't upset enough for it to ruin the night or turn them back around, which, believe me, it should have been enough. So Mike peed on the graves. He is chastised for it by his girlfriend and best friend, who think it was a real dick move, and they move on and continue walking around. They noticed, however, that from that point on, quote, the whole atmosphere changed, end quote. The darkness of the unlit cemetery somehow became even darker, and it was a somewhat oppressive air now, like some great weight bearing down on them. They also felt colder all of a sudden, and like they were being watched. There were random cold breezes hitting the back of their necks. This was a summer night in Florida, guys. James explained that whenever these breezes would hit them, it would blow the leaves on the trees, but he noticed that it was only the trees which were right above their heads that were blowing, while the rest of the cemetery's trees were perfectly still in the calm night air. It was even a bit humid and balmy everywhere else, except surrounding them. This is when Jen kind of mischievously tells the guys that her grandmother used to tell her that when a cold breeze blows on you like that, it's a spirit passing through you. While this had somewhat of the desired effect in creeping the guys out a bit more than they already were, it was definitely not any kind of deterrent for them, and the three continued on. Mike said, quote, I was scared, but I was excited to see what the night was about to unfold, end quote. While these cool breezes and winds were still hitting their backs, Jen decided to take a picture. Mike went between two headstones and made the rock on gesture, right, with his fingers, and Jen snapped the shot. That's when everything immediately changed. When reviewing the photo right there on the spot, they all saw two very angry spirits, just their heads and faces, above Mike and staring down at him. It was very visible, and all of them saw it, like I said. Jen started screaming at Mike for urinating on the graves and told him that he had angered the spirits of the dead, possibly the lost souls, and now they were going to be out for revenge against him. After all of them seeing the heads and angry faces in the picture with Mike, the flash drive in the camera was completely corrupted, and she had lost everything on it. It just blanked out. The whole thing went black, and she couldn't ever use it again. It was completely lost. Mike said when he saw the images above his head, he thought, quote, I knew I had just made a mistake. I did something horribly wrong, and I might pay for this now, end quote. Jen was extremely angry and also really terrified, and she wanted to just leave. James was kind of on board one way or the other despite his fear, but Mike, in his 17-year-old arrogance, concluded that this is exactly what they had come looking for, meaning some scares and a few thrills, and he convinced both James and Jen to continue exploring the cemetery to see what else was in store for them. Like, come on, guys. This wasn't enough for you to know that these spirits are angry with you, angry enough to show up in a picture and then bust up your girlfriend's camera? So onward they went through the cemetery, knowing now that not only were they not alone, but that something was definitely out to get Mike and wasn't afraid to go through James and Jen to do it. Something was pissed. This is when the whispering started. The wind was blowing whispers into their ears and all around them. It was being carried with the wind and was completely indiscernible what the whispers were saying. Mike said all he could pick up was that it sounded like children who were doing the whispering. All three of them definitely heard it as well. This is when they heard the sound of some sort of clanging metal. They listened to it for a minute or so and then looked over and saw a swinging metal gate. There were shadows of all different shapes and sizes just darting back and forth around this one gate, which led into an even older part of the cemetery. However, upon looking further, they saw some kind of huge, dark, and shadowy figure, demon-like, swinging this metal gate back and forth and staring right at Mike. He said he felt when he made eye contact with it that he was put into some kind of trance and couldn't look away. Once the other two saw this thing as well, Jen kind of grabbed his face and caught his attention, and they all decided to run away, and finally they had had enough and were going to leave and just go back to Jen's house. They took off running. As they were running away and back to the car, they had to pass the mausoleum, which at this point was wide open with the lights on. The door was swinging back and forth, and Mike said he felt compelled to start walking towards it. Something wanted him to go in. He said something inside of him was willing him to walk towards and step inside of the mausoleum. Once again, he seemed to be in a complete trance state until Jen snapped him out of it, and then he turned away from the mausoleum and started going forward again to leave. But he was compelled once again to turn back and stepped forward as if ready to walk into it. But as soon as he reached the door, it slammed shut and all the lights went off again. They were almost to the car when Mike turned around, and standing there right in front of him was this giant demon creature they had seen swinging the gate a few moments earlier. Mike said it was just radiating pure malice, evil, and hatred, complete and total anger, and it raised its hand and pointed its finger right at him and was stomping what seemed to be his feet. He said, quote, "I could tell that it wanted me to pay for what I had done, and then it made a dash toward me, and then I just ran, man. I just ran as fast as I could," end quote. The picture I see is kind of like a bear, or even, excuse the hilarity, a sumo wrestler stomping his feet and taking that fighting stance. Mike is able to do nothing but point it out to warn his girlfriend and best friend what's going on, and they all look and see it as well. The thing gave chase, and the three took off again towards the car. They finally made it to the car, hopped in, and sped off, never looking back. They all decided to stay at Jen's house that night, but Mike didn't get any sleep and left to go home as soon as the sun came up. He made it home to his very religious mother's house and went right to bed. He was terrified that this demon thing would show itself to him while he was sleeping, but out of sheer exhaustion at that point, he had finally fallen asleep. He woke up at around 3 a.m., which, in my opinion, not a coincidence at all, guys, and he was in what seems to me to be a kind of sleep paralysis state. He said he couldn't move at all except his eyes and felt a heaviness on his body and like someone or something was trying to choke him. He couldn't breathe and his neck and chest hurt. As he looked up with his eyes, he saw the demon creature from the forest cemetery, and then just as quickly, it was gone. When he woke up the next day, he said it was like he knew he wasn't himself. He felt some kind of heaviness and oppression all around and on top of him. When he went into the bathroom to brush his teeth, he said when he looked in the mirror, it was like he wasn't looking back at himself. Does that make sense? So he looked in the mirror and saw a shadowy figure, which he knew right away was a demon thing from the night before, directly behind him in the shower. However, when he opened it, there was nothing there at all. He knew he wasn't imagining things, and he also knew that he was screwed. He remembered when they had gotten back into the car, Jen had told him that the thing they had just saw was a demon and that it was there for him, for Mike. He knew instinctively that something bad was going to happen to him. Jen had warned him he would be lucky if nothing attached itself to him for peeing all over those graves. Mike said, quote, "I was just thinking like, oh my God, what if this thing like attached itself to my soul," end quote. He said even though his mother was very religious and would believe and possibly help him, he didn't tell her right away because he didn't want to upset or scare her. So the next day after this horrific sleep paralysis incident, and the same day as he woke up feeling kind of haunted by this oppressive feeling and knowing the demon was there, so 2 days later after the cemetery incident and or encounter, James goes over to Mike's house to see what's up because he hadn't heard from him since the whole ordeal. Mike tells James what's been going on and about how he's feeling and also about the nightmare. That's when James notices and points out to Mike the huge and long scratches running all up and down his neck, and they also notice his chest was all scratched up too. I'm very happy and relieved to inform you guys, although it shocked me because people always seem to try and ignore these types of things until they get way more out of hand than they have or need to, that Mike went straight away to his mother and showed and told her everything and asked for her help. Good for you, Mike. You finally made a smart move. His mother immediately called in a priest, and the priest looked Mike up and down and knew right away there was something evil going on. The priest prayed with Mike and then told him and his mother that he could feel an essence not only in the house but surrounding Mike specifically, and that it was a demon. The priest said Mike had angered spirits, and when he did this, those angry spirits called for a demon to avenge them. The priest immediately called for an exorcism. On the night of the exorcism, the priest was able to get the demon to show itself, and he finally did get it to leave Mike alone. Mike said he had long ago lost his faith in God and turned his back on his religion because of bad things that had happened to him that he blamed God for. After the exorcism, though, he said that he not only got his faith back, but that he's now humbled. He doesn't act impulsively anymore and respects things he doesn't know about, like graves in a cemetery and anything having to do with spirit in general. The only thing that he said about the exorcism that he kind of remembered was that he felt this extreme and intense hatred, rage, and anger towards the priest, and that his body felt like it was literally burning while it was happening, like literally legit on fire. Otherwise, he says he remembers nothing at all. Jen wouldn't be interviewed about it and doesn't even speak of it anymore, and I have no clue if she and Mike are even still together. Probably not, but who knows. That's all I have for you today, guys. I really hope you enjoyed this first video of encounters with demons in the forest. I might do like part 1 encounters, then part 2 the basics, kind of like I did with the shadow people, kind of like I'm going to be doing with Glimmermen and faceless humanoid entities. So I really hope you enjoyed this video. If you did, please give it a big thumbs up. Subscribe if you aren't already, and spread the love by sharing. Also, do me a big favor and check out that description box for some important links. Justice for Caleb Smith, the 2-hour interview Steve Stockton and I did on missing persons and mysteries a few months ago. We are trying to get some justice for Caleb and his mother, his family, because April should not have to be investigating her own son's murder. No mother or parent should have to do that, investigate their own child's death. Justice for Caleb Smith. Also, you'll find links to Sunday night's Fireside Chat, Friday night Campfire Stories from 7 to 8 p.m. Eastern Time, both on Missing Persons and Mysteries with Stemma, myself, and Steve Stockton, and our Wednesday night live stream that we have here on this channel from 7 to 9 p.m. It's 2 hours, and most of the time we're going to be doing some oracle reading. We got a little carried away last week and ended up going almost 4 hours. Totally drained Steve and I, so we've got to come up with a better system, but the link will be in the description box. Also, links for Patreon and PayPal if you want to make a financial donation to the channel. Guys, be kind to each other. It doesn't cost anything. Makes you feel really good. Kindness is like forgiveness. It's for the person who's giving it. But also, be kind to yourself. Smile at a stranger. Always go in grace. Have your best day. Have your best night. And I will see you next time. Bye-bye.